Good morning, students. This lecture is for March the 30th. I hope uh, everything is well with you, that you're staying safe, and that you're able to keep up with your school studies. We are talking about the late 19th century, and we have been talking about the Americas and how things were changing, how the United States fought a civil war that was totally devastating, how Canada was able, without a war, to gain independence, and how Latin America was pretty much made dependent upon the various Europeans who invested within their borders. Well, as we break this down, let's think about society in the United States first. Of course, as they move west, American settlers run into the Native Americans. And as they had been in the East, Americans look at the Native Americans as an impediment. And so the government is literally systematically going to destroy the various Native American tribes. It is a horrendous war of genocide, and literally the Western Plains Indians are going to be fighting for their very existence. It's going to be a very brutal war. A war with little mercy shown on either side. And yet, systematically, former Union generals are going to bring about the dismantling of the tribes and the settling of these Native Americans who have been used to a wandering nomadic lifestyle to a reservation. Now, a few things about these reservations. Normally, they are poor land. Any promises that were made for provisions for the individuals on the reservations are, for the most part, broken and forgotten about. You take a people who have been nomadic wanderers following herds and so on, and try to force them into becoming farmers. And so you can see how horrific the situation actually was. And it was a terribly, terribly horrific thing. And so any treaty that was ever made by the United States with the Native Americans wound up being broken time and time again as greed drove people of the United States westward. And let's realize that too many of these Native Americans, being animistic in their religious beliefs, land to them could be considered sacred. And so you have Americans moving in on sacred land in Indian territory, which compounded things and made things even worse. And so it is a horrendous situation. And the Native Americans are put in terrible, terrible straits as they are systematically destroyed and rounded up and put on these reservations. Well, then we have the former slaves, especially in the American South. And all kinds of promises were made to them, but for the most part, you're going to have, during what is called Reconstruction, that will go all the way to 1877, you're going to have a period of terror, of distrust, of broken promises, and many a former slave and many a poor white farmer are going to be pushed into a form of farming called sharecropping. We mentioned this in our last lecture. Now, sharecropping will be something that lasts in the United States, and especially the South, well into the 20th century. And well into the 20th century, the southern portion of the United States will be the poorest, most backward region in all of the United States. And let's realize also during Reconstruction, federal armies occupied the South. And that occupation brought a violent backlash among people who were defeated, but they were not defeated. They were going to try to retain a semblance of the life they had before, and they were willing to fight for it. Well, as time changes in the late 19th century, the women's movement continues to gather some steam and continues to build up. We see the building of women's colleges, reform activism. Many women go into professional industrial jobs, and some young women are actually allowed to pursue careers over marriage. And so there are some changes. Not as many as women would like to see, but yet some improvements in the circumstances in which American women find themselves. And then we have the migration that we've talked about. Of course, millions of Europeans are going to wind up coming to the United States, and as they do, they're going to introduce new foods, new music, new dances, holidays, sports, languages, and what they're going to do is contribute to the greater cultural diversity of the United States. Now, as most of these individuals move into the U.S., they are generally going to try to locate in a community where people from their home nation or people who speak their language are located. And so you'll have a little Italy and a little Ireland and a little China all in New York City as individuals immigrate and move into these communities. And first generation obviously is going to be the most difficult. For many of these people, the United States is going to be a completely new way of life, and it's going to be a new language. Many of them are going to come here very poor or broke, and they're going to have to begin from scratch. So that first generation will try to be a tight group with people from the home country. The second generation will loosen up a little bit, and by third generation, generally people are going to become very much integrated into American society. And so this can be a very, very difficult and challenging process, and yet it is a process through which millions will go. And it brings up a very interesting point about the United States. We're a bunch of mutts. We're definitely a people who are mixed. So many backgrounds, so much diversity, not only within the nation, but within individual families. And so this is going to be what develops in America in the late 19th century. All right. In the North, French and British settlers are basically going to do to the indigenous people what had been done in North America and in the United States. There will be blacks in Canada. They will not be considered equal there. They will be segregated, and they will be isolated from the cultural mainstream of what's going on in Canadian society. The communities that descend from the British and French settlers are going to dominate society, and sometimes there will be a lack of cohesion between them. There were actually times when Quebec talked about seceding from Canada. So it doesn't always work smoothly, even with our northern neighbors. Well, in Latin America, of course, you have the Creoles, those of European ancestry, that are the top of the society. You have then indigenous people, freed slaves, their descendants, and they go on to the lower rungs of society. There will be a large-scale migration. It will bring some cultural diversity, but a lot of the Europeans will seek to isolate themselves from the local populations, and they will tend to live in European communities. Now, one thing that will definitely characterize Latin America is a strong sense of male dominance. This is going to be characteristic of Latin America even into today. And so that is going to very much be a part of their society and their way of life. Okay, moving on into chapter 28 then. And I need to give you a good bit of background so you understand. Now, we're going to call the age roughly between 1870 and 1914 the age of imperialism. Now, your textbook calls it empire, but as you will see in our discussion, this is definitely an age of imperialism. Of course, the second industrial revolution has gone on, as we have noted, and this is going to be a very important motivation for the imperialism, because you're going to have especially European countries that are going to be scrambling to get natural resources to keep their industrial productions up and going. And so with steel, with chemicals, with electricity, with petroleum, all of these things are going to help pave the way for this imperialistic march. As we noted, there is a new consumer society out there, not just in the United States, but throughout especially the western part of the world. Germany has become an industrial giant, and in doing so, they are right in the mix of all the competition that is going on. A mass society is developing throughout nations. That's coming about with education, with leisure-type reading leading the way there. European states are going to focus on 5 domestic policies, and these are very, very important for you to understand. Number 1, the achievement of liberal practices. We're moving slowly but surely away from the idea of an absolute monarchy. Of course, France is going to experiment with this a whole lot. And so we're going to try to have change occurring in these countries. We're going to have the growth of political democracy, organization of mass political parties, and they're going to kind of borrow this from the United States somewhat. The rise of working class parties. unions. And of course, there will be a rise of socialism in Europe. And then the enactment of social welfare. So all of these are going to be policies that the Europeans form on. The United States, not so much, as we will see. Okay, so what is imperialism? Literally, it is the dominion over subject lands by a stronger nation. That is formal imperialism. Informal imperialism, that stronger nation dominates trade, investment, and business activities. So to a limited extent, what I said about Europeans investing in Latin America, that would be a type of informal imperialism in Latin America. So as we look at this age, we have colonialism. But it's not just the settlement, but it is the political, social, economic, and cultural structures that are all dominated in this land by the more powerful, obviously most of the time, European nation. And so, for example, Britain will ultimately gain dominance in India, and it will dominate everything. It will literally control the nation. Okay. What motivated imperialism? Well, number one, during the second half of the 19th century, most Europeans are going to come to believe that imperial expansion and colonial dominion were actually crucial for the very survival of their society. These foreign markets are going to be saturated with their products. Most states are going to be blocking themselves with protective tariffs. So it's very important that you find areas where, for lack of a better terminology, you can unload your products on someone. And so these states you dominate are areas that you can do that. Hence, remember what the British tried to do in the North American colonies. Okay, there's a lot of international rivalry going on. And of course, this does, in a very limited sense of the word, generate a period of peace. So that's economics. We got to compete with everybody else. We've got to beat everybody else. And so the best way to do so is to have more markets that we can force our goods into than everyone else. Okay, there were political motives. Number two, imperialists held that it was crucial for both political and military reasons to hold these territories. And quite honestly, some of these territories occupied very strategic sites on the world's sea lanes, and others offered harbors and supply stations where these various countries could take care of their navies. Even spiritual motives, number three, will foster imperialism, because missionaries are going to follow these home nations into these countries, and it is going to be their determined idea that we will elevate the status of the local people by bringing them to Christianity. And so they're going to be in search of new converts and spreading their faith in these various countries. And of course, realize a Catholic state is going to be spreading Catholicism. A Protestant state is going to be spreading their form of Protestantism. And there are, number 4, even cultural motives to imperialism. The Europeans, who, yes, quite honestly, have become very full of themselves. Now, realize how long it was that Europe lagged behind everyone else in the development of the world. Well, as Europe has come on, as Europe has become more educated and become movers and shakers in the world, they are full of themselves, and so they have the idea, well, we can go into these backward nations and we can in turn bring them cultural enlightenment. And so we're going to make them better people than they have been. And so you've got economics, political, religious, and cultural, all being motivations for imperialism. Now, there are going to be a few things that are going to help imperialism tremendously. Steam power being added to ships. And after the Civil War, especially, nations are going to begin to develop ironclad ships. We're going to move from wood to iron as ships of war. And these ships are going to be armed with very, very powerful weapons. Of course, they can travel faster than a sailing vessel, and the more power, the more firepower you can put upon one of these things, the better you have of enforcing your way and your will, and so on. Quite honestly, the United States is going to make a tremendous contribution. The Panama Canal. This is a brainchild of President Teddy Roosevelt. In that little narrow isthmus of Central America, a canal will be cut, and that will take off time for shipping from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Instead of having to sail all the way down the coast of South America and then all the way back up the coast of South America, it will allow you to cut through there. And the Panama Canal, under normal circumstances, is an international thing. So you can speed up military deployment, you can speed up trade, and international individuals could make themselves available of the Panama Canal. You're going to have the building of railroads. The United States, in the latter part of the 19th century, as will many other nations, totally link itself together by the building of these railroads, and it will tie the countries together even more. All right. By the middle of the 19th century and moving into the latter part of that century, we move from muzzle-loading weapons, where you load at the end of the barrel, to breech-loading weapons. That way you don't have to flip the gun every time you load it. You simply pop it open or click a lever or whatever, and that makes loading much quicker. Also, guns are now being rifled. There's a groove down the barrel, and that helps the projectile come out and not wobble around as much, but to be very much on target. It gives more velocity to the weapon and allows more accuracy with it. Where during the American Revolution, the killing range of a musket at best was about 50 yards. During the American Civil War, it had grown to more than 300 yards. And with these rifles, it becomes even more. Europeans are also inventing what are called machine guns. And these are rapid fire weapons that are going to be so very devastating, especially during World War I and World War II. And so these accurate firing weapons and these fast firing weapons and easy to reload weapons are going to become devastating on opposing forces. And by the way, a note to add here, our friends in the Arab states have kind of backed off and withdrawn themselves from some of the modern things that are going on. And military technology is one of those areas that they are going to begin to lag behind. Then we're going to have communications. Steamships are going to get us across the oceans quicker. That's going to take and hurry things up. The telegraph, of course, that's going to speed up information transformations, and that will take place both in Europe and the United States. Ultimately, we're going to lay an underground cable to help communication from the United States all the way into Europe. And so we're better able to communicate with each other. So let's talk about some of this European imperialism. And beginning in 1870, it just explodes. The British will go into India. They will finally drive the Dutch out, and they will assume total activity for what goes on. They will take out the northern Indian Muslim state. They will send their merchants throughout the country. They will win rights to everything. And they will literally wage a very bloody campaign in which thousands of native Indians will lose their lives. And not all of these lives are going to be lost in battle. A lot of them are going to be lost in hangings, desecrations of villages, and things of that nature. And so, by 1858, Britain is totally dominating India. And they have done so by whatever means they thought was necessary to do so. The old adage, might makes right, very much applied in India. Okay, to profit from what India had to offer, the British officials cleared forests. They encouraged cultivation of crops, tea, coffee, and opium. And opium is going to be a very valuable British trade item, especially as they begin to deal with the Chinese. They do make a little effort, not a tremendous effort, but a little effort to promote Christianity. And they do establish some English-style schools for the children of the Indian elite. But they suppress Indian customs that conflicted with European laws or values. So basically, what the British are doing in India, the United States is doing in the Great Plains. We are going to enforce ourselves on them. Okay? The Dutch are still going to be in the East Indies, and as the British come in, they are going to try to solidify their holdings in this region. The only other area in the Pacific that had a major European influence at the time was the Spanish Philippines. So, here come the British again. They move into Burma. They move into Singapore. They move into Malaysia. Well, the French are not going to be outdone. And so they build a large colony in French Indochina. Now, you actually know that is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And they will introduce European-style schools there. They will encourage the conversion to Christianity. And basically, all of Southeast Asia will come under European imperial rule, except for the Kingdom of Siam, which is modern Thailand. Now, Thailand will try to introduce Western-style education, and it will more or less serve as a buffer zone between the French and the British interests there. Well, as Europeans continued to seek territories and rule them as colonies, two formerly very powerful societies, the Ottoman and the Qing, will come under informal dominion, as each struggled with a weakened military internal problems in comparison to the very strong industrial states that existed in Europe. And so by the late 17th century, but especially by the late 19th century, it was obvious that Ottoman forces were lagging far, far behind anything that the Europeans were doing. It may have been able to maintain its authority in Anatolia and Iraq, but it's going to lose all of its holdings in Southeast Europe. The Caucasus, Central Asia, the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, all of these lands will become independent of the Ottoman Empire. So slowly but surely, as the Byzantine Empire had done, the Ottoman Empire is now beginning to shrink away. Significantly, in 1798, Napoleon is actually going to invade and conquer Egypt. And he will have established himself as a fairly influential person. Ultimately, after the French are expelled, an energetic general named Muhammad Ali, sounds like a fighter's name, will establish himself as the ruler of Egypt, and technically, he will actually be the most powerful influence in the Muslim world. So the Ottoman Turks have really, really gotten themselves in trouble by somewhat withdrawing. Of course, European textiles, European manufacture, this begins to flow into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans can't keep up. They are technologically way behind the Europeans. And again, that hurts them. And so economic development in the Ottoman Empire comes to, like Latin America, depend upon foreign loans. And these foreign nations, of course, want to be able to control whatever is going on there. And literally, the Ottomans are going to compromise. They're going to allow these Europeans to come in. And literally, the Ottomans will live under Islamic law, and they will allow the Europeans to live under their particular national laws. So that's how weakened the Ottoman Empire has actually come to be. Now, Under Sultan Mahmud II, there is an attempt to build a little more effective army. He does start a system of secondary education for boys, not for young women. And by 1839, in spite of his efforts, the Ottoman Empire had shrunk tremendously. So the Ottomans are becoming weaker and weaker and weaker. Seems like every time they go to a war with somebody, they wind up losing. And so as they lose these wars, as we have seen, many of their subject states begin to fight for and claim independence. Now, the Qing problems became really serious when the British began to trade in opium rather than silver. And literally, what the British do to be able to, in effect, conquer China is get the Chinese people hooked on opium. China will fight this, 1839 to 1842. But the Chinese army is absolutely no match for the British army. And literally the British Navy will destroy the Chinese coastal forts. And so throughout the second half of the 19th century, China is going to lose in a war with Britain and France. They're going to lose against France alone. And they're going to lose against Japan. And in the wake of all of these disasters come a series of treaties which are extremely unequal. They benefit the European powers, and of course, they don't do that much for the Chinese people. By 1990, get that, 90 Chinese ports were under the effective control of foreign powers. Now, there will be several large-scale rebellions that will take place. There will be one in 1850, one 1851 to 68, 1855, 1873, 1862, 1878, 1850, 1864. And these are going to be in various parts of China. And of course, they're going to do a tremendous amount of destruction to China. And instead of helping it, building it, and developing it, actually, it's going to help bring China down. And then with the war with Japan, this is devastating. France will take Vietnam, Great Britain will detach Burma, Japan will force China to recognize the independence of Korea, and by 1898, foreign powers had carved China into spheres of economic influence. And there's a newcomer involved in this. And that newcomer is the United States. Yes, even the United States realizes to keep a central and important position in all the trade that is going on in the world, that they too are going to have to enter this competition. Now, they will not go to Africa, that we will talk about in a little bit, but they will go into China and into the Philippines, as we will talk about. So, in 1899, there is a major rebellion to rid foreigners, devils as they were called, from China. And 140,000 plus what are called Boxers will besiege the foreign embassies in Beijing in the summer of 1900. But they were crushed because you had the heavily armed forces of the British, French, Russians, U.S., German, and Japanese troops. And they all cooperated together in defeating the Chinese. There will be another revolution breakout in 1911, and in 1912, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty will be forced to abdicate his throne. And of course, this would be a humiliating situation for the once very proud Chinese people. Well, imperialism takes on another look as well. Africa, it's lagging behind Europe, and we've already discussed some reasons why this is true. And so, quite honestly, to avoid war, in Berlin there is a West African Conference called. It met from 1884 to 1885. And it literally devised the ground rules for the division of Africa. By the way, not one African state is invited to come to this thing. But we're going to have the ground rules so we don't go to war with each other over carving up Africa. So basically, the European powers get together and they decide what parts of Africa they are going to divide up. And quite honestly, every modern state of Africa, except Ethiopia, because it was a Christian state, and Liberia, which was a little, very small republic that had been established for former U.S. slaves to flee to, these were the only ones that remained independent. Otherwise, Africa is just totally carved up. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. Right now, we're trying to remain peaceful. We're trying to play nice in the world. People are trying to get along with one another and trying to avoid war. But look at it from a practical standpoint. Europeans have been prone to go to war quite often with each other. It is a very common happenstance with them. And if Europeans are dividing up various parts of the nation, if Europeans decide to go to war against one another, you can imagine that this war will in no way be self-contained to the European continent. So any potential war in the future is going to be one that will turn out to be global. And that is exactly what is going to happen. Now, one of the areas most fought over will actually be South Africa. This will be the Dutch, who have been there for a long, long time, and it will be with the British. And the various Africans are going to side with one or the other or use both against each other or whatever they might be able to do. And so ultimately, the British will win out on this. And then we begin to expand into the southern Pacific. British settlers are going to go into Australia in the late 18th century, and quite honestly, they are going to flood that country a lot of times with prisoners. And as happened in North America, South America, and so on, diseases are going to ravage the indigenous people there, and this in turn will allow people to flood in and take over that country. They will also go to New Zealand. On smaller Pacific islands, the indigenous people again will be ravaged by European diseases. But for the most part, on these smaller islands, the Europeans did not have great desires to have total dominance over them. And so basically having trade ports and the abilities to get fruits especially, which would be important for sailors and so on, they will agree at that Berlin conference to partition Oceania only in the sense of spheres of influence. And so you will have Spanish, you will have French, you will have German, you will have British, you will have the United States, and Japan will very obviously be left out of this decision. Okay, as we say, the United States realizes it's going to have to do something. So leaders in this country become interested in acquiring territories out of the United States. In 1867, we're actually going to purchase Russia, or Alaska, from Russia. And this is going to be called Seward's Folly. Of course, the amazing thing about it was shortly after the United States gains possession of it, gold is discovered. And so it turns out to be a tremendous boost. And then in 1875, the United States is going to claim to be a protectorate of the Hawaiian Islands. In other words, we're going to look out after them. And of course, more and more and more American influence will take over. And finally, by the late 19th century, the United States will acquire the islands as the last rightful ruler of the land is forced to advocate from her position. But the United States' first big effort is going to be as a result, quite honestly, of the Monroe Doctrine. For years, Cuba in the Caribbean has been struggling against the Spanish. And the United States has given some support, but not much, to the Cubans. So in 1898, a U.S. warship, the Maine, sails into Havana Harbor and basically just show the Spanish what we have in comparison to what they have as a Navy. And there is an explosion on the Maine. Now, immediately the press in the United States fans the flames that this was a Spanish terrorist act against the United States, and they are pushing for war. So as all of these things are going on, we need to talk about a couple of very enterprising men. And I think it's very important that we understand both of these men's stories. One of them is named Theodore Roosevelt. He is the Undersecretary of Navy. Now, basically, the Undersecretary of Navy, he is a figurehead that just kind of has a little power when the Secretary of Navy is out of Washington and engaged somewhere else. So, as Roosevelt sees the dominoes falling, as he sees an opportunity for war, and he is a very opportunistic individual, he orders the U.S. Pacific Fleet to sail out of San Francisco and head toward the Philippines. Now, understand, in 1898, when this takes place, you're not going to be able to communicate with those ships again until they reach the Philippines. So once they're sailed, they're gone unless you've got a ship fast enough to catch them, which did not exist in that day and time. Now, Roosevelt realizes such an action is going to cost him his job, so he immediately resigns, goes to his state senator, gets an appointment as a colonel, and begins to build what will be called the Rough Riders. What he wants to do is build an army unit that would reflect the diversity of the United States. And so he gets business people from the north, he gets southern farmers, he gets western cowboys, he gets any and everything he can to begin to build his military unit. And so this is how he is going to begin to advance himself. Well, another individual sees an opportunity. His name is Joseph Wheeler from Upper Alabama. He had been a general in the Civil War. He had been a Confederate cavalry general. In fact, he actually fought a battle that extended from Marion into Sequatchie County during the war. Now, Southern generals didn't get great positions in the United States military after the war. And quite honestly, Wheeler had been away since the time of the Civil War. So we're talking a long period of time separated from military service. But Wheeler goes to his senator and gets a brigadier general's commission. And of course, the United States Army looks at Wheeler's record and realizes he was a very capable commander, so he is actually going to be given command of the U.S. troops that will invade Cuba. Well, an interesting side effect of this war is going to be the fact that probably in a very special way, partially because of Wheeler, partially because Southerners tend to be patriotic anyway, the Spanish-American War is going to help heal some of the wounds that had existed so long after the American Civil War. So that's going to be an interesting byproduct. Well, what happens? We go to Cuba, and there we're going to engage the Spanish. The first day of battle is quite interesting. Now, a couple of points. Number one, General Wheeler has contracted malaria. Cuba has lots of little mosquitoes, and they tend to bite. And so he is running a reasonably high fever, but he is still in control of himself, and so he's going to command the American troops. Basically, as soon as he comes out, a sniper shoots his horse. Everybody panics as this gray-headed man hits the ground, and basically he gets up, dusts himself off, and says, "Oh, boys, don't worry about it. I had 30 shot out from under me in the last war." And he gets on another horse and commands. Now, the one major flaw in his command is that the fever has caused him a little memory gap. And so every order Wheeler gives, being rather than directed against the Spanish, winds up being directed against the Yankees. Now, Wheeler has as his adjutant his son. And so I want you to try to get this picture because it had to be humorous. So here would be General Wheeler. He would give a command, charge the Yankees at this point. And his son would say, "Spanish, Dad." Or attack the Yankees at this point, "Spanish, Dad." So all day long, it's something Yankees, Spanish, Dad, as the battles take place. But Wheeler actually puts together a very good battle plan. And Roosevelt gets his day of glory, charging up San Juan Hill. One thing that I think is important for us to note is that in this charge up San Juan Hill, yes, Roosevelt's Rough Riders did have a very important role to play, but 2 regiments of black troops were on his left flank. They charged the enemy, they went up the hill, they showed every bit as much of courage and determination, and every much had a part in the victory that is won, as did Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. But because Roosevelt was from a privileged family, obviously he gets a lot more attention. Well, what happens in the Philippines? Well, by the time the U.S. fleet gets there, we are legally at war. And so the U.S. fleet, both in the Caribbean and the Pacific, decimate the Spanish fleet. The Spanish were way behind in military development, and so they are totally decimated in this war. And the United States takes possession of the Philippines. It did not take possession of Cuba. It will Puerto Rico, but Cuba will be allowed its independence. There will be a lot of American investment there, but Cuba will be allowed to be independent. Now, literally, when President McKinley decides to bring the Philippines under American control instead of giving them their independence, there will be a revolution in the Philippines that, quite honestly, will last longer than the Spanish-American War lasted. And so, in the end, we have U.S. forces in Cuba, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, and, of course, Puerto Rico. We have Guam and the Philippines, and the U.S. justification for taking Guam and the Philippines is to keep the Japanese out. Let's pause here. Late 19th century, Japan has defeated Russia and China in a war, and the U.S. wants to compete to keep Japan out of certain islands and out of certain influential places. Should that not have raised a lot of red flags? And should that not have caused a lot of people to keep a much more critical eye upon Japan than actually wound up doing so? I mean, we talk about the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Quite honestly, that thing was coming a long time before 1941, because Japan was trying to expand. As I say, we have the Sino-Japanese War. We have the Russo-Japanese War. In fact, President Roosevelt will actually get a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating peace between Japan and Russia in this war. And this war will show Russia actually how weak they have become, not only in comparison with Western Europe, but in comparison with the little island nation of Japan. So, what are the legacies of all of this? Well, number one, the world size shrinks. There are more links between more people in the world than have ever been in history. But at the same time as we have these greater links together, people are brought into a heightened sense of conflict, and quite honestly, with the teaching of the scientific idea of eugenics, which is basically scientific racism based upon evolution, you have greater differences being recognized between people. So Europeans look at themselves as being superior to Africans or Middle Easterners or Asians, and so do the people in the United States. The Japanese will begin to view themselves as being superior to other Asian people. And so this idea of eugenics is going to further divide the world and further bring about racial divisions and racial prejudices throughout the world. You're going to have a lot of European migration as these various colonies come up, just as you had had in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. Indentured servanthood is going to come back because we don't have slavery anymore. And so there are going to be Europeans that are going to move from place to place to place, and they're going to do so to try to establish themselves. So let's talk about this eugenics, scientific racism. It's actually going to, quite honestly, if you think about it and carry it to its logical extent, it is going to be the background of the Holocaust of World War II. So, in eugenics, we're going to look at social, we're going to look at cultural differences, we're going to look at the shape of someone's head, the color of their skin, and we're actually going to have a hierarchy of human races. Now, let's understand, there is no such thing anywhere in the world as a racially pure race of people. But during the late 19th century, there are going to be individuals who conclude that there are some superior racial groups. And of course, the Europeans are going to buy into this heavily. So Charles Darwin is going to contribute heavily to this particular scientific thought. So Africans, Jews, Slavs, all kinds of peoples in the world, Arabs, so on. All of these individuals are going to be on the lower ranks, and they're thereby going to be disdained by many. And let's clearly understand that these racist views are by no means the monopoly of the European imperialists. The U.S., the Japanese, they're also going to buy into this. So there is going to remain through the late 19th, early 20th century, a tremendous racial bias in the United States. White is going to be viewed one way, red, black, yellow, all going to be viewed other ways. And so as we move into the dawn of the 20th century, we move into a period of time that, quite honestly, is very, very dangerous for the world, very, very dangerous for peoples, and attitudes are beginning to set up for what is about to come. And what is about to come is going to be something horrendous. it is going to be called World War I. And definitely it will be the most disastrous thing to come in the history of humankind up to that point. Okay, this ends our section. And so we're going to need to plan a test. So it's very important that you read the news notes and eLearn, because I will be explaining to you what we're going to do for this next test and how we're going to conduct it. But we'll go ahead and end class here for now, and I wish you a very good day.